Recording. And it's all yours, Charlie.
All right, everybody can hear me? Please nod, yeah. Okay, well, I grew up in Arlington and went away to college, settled in Alexandria, and then came back in the early 90s, where my wife and I raised our two children. And I've been a journalist or in book publishing since the mid 70s. And for the last, I've worked at the Washington Post, Congressional Quarterly, National Journal, and Atlantic Media, and a couple of education groups. And it was about 11 years ago that the Falls Church News Press had a vacancy for the Our Man in Arlington column. It was being written by Richard Barton. Maybe some of you know him too. He's been around Arlington for a long time. And so I did that as a moonlighter. And in the column, Our Man in Arlington, my assignment is to put some Arlington stuff in the Falls Church paper, but it's also read by a slice of North Arlington. And I try to alternate between history and current affairs. It's nonpartisan. I don't really endorse candidates or policies, but I do deal with lifestyle issues and development and some controversies when I can. And so in 2019, I retired from my day job as a reporter for a government executive, which was owned by Atlantic Media, covering federal agencies. And I spent most of my time writing a biography of George Washington Parke Custis, who's the creator of Arlington House. And he grew up at Mount Vernon as George Washington's step-grandson. And we can talk about that book on another occasion if you like. But it came out last fall at the same time that my more pop book called Lost Arlington County came out. And I'll show you that in a minute. And it deals with more nostalgia and preservation in Arlington. And I should also mention that I've been in the Arlington Historical Society for about 20 years. But last year they asked me to come on the board. And I have to sort of balance my role as a journalist columnist with being on the board of that. It's really more of an education and an advocacy group. But I'm chairman of the preservation committee. So this book has some of their message in it, which I'm delighted to talk more about today. So this is my granddaughter shamelessly hyping my books in the Costco aisle there. She's got the two earlier ones, Arlington County Chronicles and Hidden History of Arlington. And then this is the new one that came out last fall, which I'll talk about now. And then I should also mention that the Historical Society published on its website an interactive story map that I produced with some technical help that was done in time for the 100th anniversary of Arlington taking its name, which was from 1920 to 2020. But of course, everything got delayed by the pandemic. But it's an interactive map, meaning it shows you scenes that you would see in Arlington if you were walking around in 1920, right when it took its name. It used to be Alexandria County. And but it also allows you to see exactly where in the county that scene is. And you can zoom in. And then I have some captions on many of them, but not all. Someday maybe we'll fill in more of those captions. But you can find that on the arlingtonhistoricalsociety.org. Okay, so we've had a rash of teardowns in Arlington. It's sort of part of the lifestyle now that a lot of the post-World War I and II housing is being demolished and luxury homes are replacing them, very expensive luxury homes. But two notable ones in the past year that I've written a lot about, and that there were protests too, that this is the what was called the Fellows McGrath House, or the Memory House. It was at Washington Boulevard and near Sycamore, and it was built in the 1890s, Victorian gingerbread, and it was a bed and breakfast back in the 40s and 50s. It was also the home of the first mayor of Falls Church and the first county board chairman of Arlington. It was the same guy, Harry Fellows. And this neighborhood, when he built this house, was actually part of Falls Church, and then it was seceded to Arlington in 1936. So here's a shot of what happened to this house last December. And I was lucky to get there in time to snap this picture. I had been interviewing the developer, and he was kind of mysterious, but I did get some information out of him. this happened about 6 months after the February Lothrop house was torn down. Now that was at Wilson Boulevard and McKinley Street. And roots of that house go back to before the Civil War. And it was actually a campground and hospital during the Civil War. And then it was rebuilt and designed by the Lothrop family of the department store fame as kind of a summer retreat in rural Arlington. They had a Beaux-Arts mansion down there on Connecticut Avenue. And the owner since 1950 was Randy Rouse, whom I knew. He was a home builder and an equestrian, famous out in the Middleburg area. And I did a long interview with him, and then we sipped scotch while he fact-checked my long article on the history of his house. And he died in 2017 at age 100. And his younger wife, whom I also knew, kind of lost, she didn't have control over the fate of the house. It was in the hands of a trust. And they were obligated as fiduciaries to sell it to the highest bidder. And the county considered buying it. And they would have considered it for a school site. It's real near McKinley Elementary, affordable housing, or a park, or a storage site for buses or whatever. And it was, or some combination of all that. But the market value was about $23 million. And the county board was felt burned by a purchase they had made 15 years earlier of the Reeves farmhouse down there in Bluemont Park. So they shied away from it, and there was a lot of protests and people were upset. And then last April, the wrecking ball came there. You can see one of the pieces of equipment out there getting started on the exterior buildings, and then slowly they worked its way through. Now, the other fun thing about the house is that Randy Rouse's first wife, he was only married to her for 2 years, was Audrey Meadows, the actress from the TV show The Honeymooners, who played opposite Jackie Gleason. And she used to tape that show in New York City while living here in Arlington. And she would fly up there on Thursday nights for the taping, and then she would come back here and ride around Seven Corners in this red Buick that the TV people had given her. And so she chose the wallpaper for this house, and that's why this picture is of interest to think. And Randy, after they divorced after just 2 years, they kept this wallpaper up, I guess, sort of in her honor. Now, this is another one of the Fabre houses that, there's about 4 of them in Arlington, and there's only really one left now. This was at 2210 North Madison Street. It was built in the 1850s too, and it was probably also a Civil War hospital, and there were enslaved persons working on the site. Nicholas Fabre was the patriarch of that family, had several generations of landowners in Arlington. And this is a 1966 photo of Ron Anglin, whose family I knew, and he gave me the picture. That's why he's in there. But it's mostly to show you the house. Torn down in 1989. All right, so then we'll go in my book. I deal with a lot of these just classic things that used to be in Arlington and are no longer. So this is Abingdon Plantation. There were several versions of it going back to the 1750s. Today, it is Reagan National Airport. And if you're in the airport at the Metro or in the parking garage B, you can walk out, and there's a nice organized path of National Park Service, and the Virginia authorities have helped set up a reconstruction of the ruins of Abingdon Plantation. It was owned by the family that is the namesake of the city of Alexandria, the Alexander family, several generations. And then it was bought by John Parke Custis, who's the son of Martha Washington. And that meant that George Washington spent many hours and nights at this place in the 1770s and 80s. And as well as John Parke Custis' son, George Washington Parke Custis, and his daughter, Nellie Custis, who was born here, actually. And of course, Nellie Custis and George Washington Parke Custis end up being raised from their infanthood out at Mount Vernon. So then this house was taken over by the Hunter family, and they were prominent in the U.S. Marshal Service and the Civil War, and they wrote memoirs about it too. And it burned down in 1930. But there were still Arlingtonians who were living in it before it burned down, who were quoted and interviewed in the Arlington Historical Magazine. Now, this is the Freedmen's Village site. It was opened in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War, right after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And it was on the property of Arlington House, George Washington Parke Custis's property, that was inherited by Robert E. Lee and his wife, who was Custis's daughter. And there was about a couple hundred African-American freed people were living there, and they built, they had their own job training and health centers and schools. And it lasted until the 1880s. And then the War Department wanted to take over the land again. Arlington Cemetery is fully functional by then. And the residents and their leaders had to go to court to fight to get some financial recompense for the improvements that they had all made to these buildings before they were scattered. And many of them then went off to help form the communities of Green Valley and Johnson City in Arlington. This is the other link I have to Custis here. This is a mill that he and his enslaved and free workers would have built in 1836. And it was a grist mill and a sawmill, and it was at Columbia Pike and South Columbus Street, sort of catty corner from today's Arlington Mill Community Center. And if there's an auto body shop right near in the front of it. And if you go there on your hike or something, because you're near a trail, a WOD trail and 4 Mile Run, you can hear the roar of a waterfall today. And that gives you a good clue why this site was chosen for the mill back originally in 1808. There was a more primitive one there at the time. And this was, this engraving was done by a British artist during the Civil War, and those are Union troops marching by. It was demolished during the war. And then in the 1880s, a much fancier mill was built there by a physician named John Barcroft. And his name, of course, is all over Northern Virginia. He built a second mill out further down Columbia Pike. And his mill burned down, I think, in the 1920s and became an ice house. So this is one of the more obscure sites that you'll see in this slideshow. If you're, say you were staying at the Sheraton Hotel off of Washington Boulevard and on Orm Street, and you would see a sign saying that this is the site of the first church service in Arlington. It was on Custis's Chapel, which is on that site. But if you were turning on Washington Boulevard to go up towards Clarendon, on the exit to your right, you'll see these odd-shaped stones, and they are the remnants of what was the Oddfellows Hall there. It was there for much of the first half of the 20th century, and there were more formal graves. Most of them are Arlington House enslaved persons or Freedmen's Village survivors, and they were buried here. And then in the 60s, the more prominent ones that could be identified, the graves were moved out to Alexandria off Collingwood Road. But this is sort of a primitive remnant of that, and it could use some more research by experts, in my humble opinion. Now, this is an unusual picture that I was able to get for this book. It looks like an aerial shot of Chain Bridge, and it was taken probably around the turn of the 20th century, either from a balloon or from maybe a high cliff opposite the Potomac. But if you look in the upper left, you'll see on the palisade there is a fancy building. It was called the Highview Hotel. It was built in the 1890s as a luxury 10-room hotel with a world-class chef and a lot of advertising around the Washington area. And below there was a tavern that attracted attention and customers too. And it fell on hard times. There was a couple of scandals. There was a murder or two, and it got some very bad press. And so, and then you had the Commonwealth's attorney of Alexandria County was Crandall Mackey, who was busting up the saloons and gambling halls and brothels in Roslyn and in Jackson City, which is out by where it's today is the 14th Street Bridge. And he had property in this area too, so he was keeping an eye on the goings on around Chain Bridge. And so it's the Highview Hotel fell into disrepair, and in 1912 it burned down. And it was replaced in the 20s by the terracotta villa that's there today, erected by a prominent member of the Hoover cabinet. And the current owner of that, who's this tech billionaire, whom I met, and he gave me this photo. He owns about 4 other houses on that Palisades. Okay, this is a favorite Arlington story, but I still run into people who don't know it, so I'm happy to include it. Luna Park amusement park, built in around 1900. It's today where the sanitation plant is at Route 1 and South Glebe Road at the Alexandria border, 4-mile run. But after Crandall Mackey had kind of been such a party pooper of all the gambling and saloons, some Pittsburgh entrepreneurs erected this amusement park. It had a long slide chute and merry-go-rounds and a lot of music pavilions, and you can see how many seats it would hold for shows. And a Brooklyn act of elephants, trained elephants, was brought down very early in the tenure of Luna Park. And one night during a thunderstorm, the elephants got terrified and they broke their rope harnesses and rampaged through Northern Virginia. And some of them, it took about a week to catch them all, and some of them were as far down as Burke, Virginia. Anyway, it's a twice told tale, but a fun one. All right, some more things that people don't know were here. This is what's called the Arlington Experimental Farm. It was also on Custis's farm property, and now part of Arlington Cemetery and Henderson Hall kind of area. It was started in 1900 by the U.S. Agriculture Department. They did a lot of experiments on botanical planting, soil upkeep, and road building for farmers to coach farmers on how to bring their product to market too. And when World War II was looming, the War Department needed them, so the operations of the USDA were moved out to Beltsville. But these buildings were used, it may not be these exact ones because there were several more, were used by the Code Girls during World War II when they needed dormitory housing, which is all told in Liza Mundy's book on the Code Girls. And then in the 20s, amusements, after World War I, there was again a big appetite for the good life and amusements in Arlington. So this is what's called Arlington Beach. And it lasted from about 1921 to 29 when the great stock market crash happened. And you can see that there was canoeing and kayaking and swimming and merry-go-round and a little Ferris wheel. And there were some memoirs of people who used to go there when they were young. There were also some fishermen who lived in nearby shacks too that they mentioned. So this is a shot of the last surviving farming business in Arlington. This is Nelson Reeves at work in what we know today as Bluemont Park and Playing Field, which Nelson was born in 1900 and he inherited the farm from his father. And he worked it until 1955. And then he sold it to the county, I think at a pretty good price. And they built the baseball, football fields and the tennis courts that we all enjoy. I certainly enjoyed them when I was a kid too.
Charlie, we got a question about where was Arlington Beach located?
Good question. It was right next to 14th Street Bridge, looking towards Memorial Bridge. That would be Arlington Beach. Thank you. So Nelson died, I think, in around 1960. He became an election activist, but his farmhouse, called Reeves Land, is still there. And our county board bought it in the year 2000. They tried to make a go of it. They thought maybe it would be an education center or a wedding venue, but it needed a lot of renovation and to become ADA compliant. So it was kind of a white elephant for the Arlington County budgeters, and they sat on it for about 10 or 12 years, and they fought with the neighbors about, the neighbors wanted it to be a outdoor farm facility for the school children at nearby Ashlawn School, which continues to this day. So finally, about the county decided to sell it, and about 4 or 5 years ago, they finally reached a deal with a nonprofit that provides housing for people with disabilities, and they also got a construction company that does low cost work for nonprofits, and they're still setting up that arrangement there at the Reeves land. But meanwhile, the Ashlawn school children still get to use the lawn as an education tool, and there's a famous sledding hill that all the kids in that neighborhood of Boulevard Manor and nearby Dominion Hills favor, and that's still there too. That was preserved. Okay, preservation. Not everything's worth preserving, right? So I don't know how many people would remember where this house was, but it is today the Upton Hill outdoor park, a swimming pool and mini golf center at Wilson Boulevard and around Patrick Henry. But in 1963 or so through 68, it was the barracks of the American Nazi Party. And that's a big subject. I've done whole talks on the American Nazi Party, which we can discuss at some point. But George Lincoln Rockwell is pictured there at the right. You know, he founded it in 1958. He had about 5 locations in Arlington. And he was assassinated in August of 1967, right across the street from this house, which they were renting from a widow. And then after the assassination happened, the Nazis moved to Clarendon Courthouse area, where the Java Shack coffee shop was, and it's been renamed since. But an interesting offshoot of this story is, so we have some time, in 2017, you remember that's when there was the violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, with the neo-Nazis marching. And a week after that was the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Rockwell. And I had predicted that the Nazi sympathizers of today, the neo-Nazis, would return to commemorate that event because they had come back on the 10th anniversary in 1977. So I went to all the shops at Dominion Hills Shopping Center, including the barber shop, which was there when Rockwell was murdered in 1967. Same name, but different proprietor. And I left my card with all those people. I said, please call me on the 25th if the Nazis show up. So on that day, I happened to be engaged with some NBC News reporters who wanted me to show them where all the Nazi houses were on the 50th anniversary. And so we were standing in front of Mario's Pizza, which is also a place where the Nazis used to protest and picket because it was owned by a Jewish family who I grew up with. And we were interviewing my old friend, Alan Levine, on what it was like when the Nazis were picketing them. And we got this frantic phone call from the barbershop saying that the neo-Nazis are here. So we leaped in their van and we sped down Wilson Boulevard. We made it just in time to get one picture of these guys, which I can show you at some other time. But this is, I think the reason I wanted this in the show is to remind us that some things preservation has to be done tastefully and with some community consensus.
We also have a comment here. Said when they were in Clarendon, they were known as the National Socialist White People's Party. Or
correct. Yes. They changed their name after Rockwell died. That's a good point. And, you know, they were defended by the ACLU, this is a nationwide issue on free speech. In 1976, during the Arlington's marking of the nation's bicentennial, the Nazis got a permit and marched in the parade with everybody else there. That's a famous picture of them. So this is a collage that my friend Johnny Thomas lent me, but I thought it was interesting because it shows you the house. It was owned by General George Patton soon after he was the commandant at Fort Myer, and in the early 20th century. And it then became the Congressional School in the 1930s, private school on North Oak Street. And in 1960, they had a terrible fire. And that's what these pictures show. They're on Nash Street. I think there's a plaque there today. I meant to go look for that. And Congressional School then moved out to Sleepy Hollow Road, where it is flourishing today with a huge campus. All right, everybody who in Arlington remembers this. I remember when I was a kid, it was right in front of the Playmore bowling alley there before I-66 was built, right at Fairfax Drive and Glebe Road, North Glebe. So it was built in the 1960s by the M.T. Broyhill Construction Company, and it was rented by two federal agencies, the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and the CIA. And the architecture, it was partly done by my neighbor, Mr. Redinger, was so standout, so unusual that it became known as the Blue Goose. That's what the journalists called it, and it sort of caught on. And later on in the about 10, 15 years ago, it was purchased by Marymount University, which of course has been expanding for a long time. Its campus on North Glebe now has outposts in Ballston. And the president of the Marymount, Matthew Schrank, said that that's the ugliest building he'd ever seen. So they made plans to demolish it, but the Historical Affairs and Landmark Review Board was begging them to use a little restraint and consider preserving parts of it because it had become such a landmark, dear to the hearts of many Arlingtonians. So I have to give Marymount credit for their preservation. If you go there today, that you'll see this spanking new building that has academic classrooms, offices, and a residence, the Presley, Rixey apartments, condos. And but out front, there's an outdoor panel, set of panels that gives you the whole history of the Blue Goose building. And there are wonderful lighting effects, all done in the same two-tone blue. And you can see that at night too, and it's very well done. And I have to give Marymount credit for spending some money and effort on that.
I have a couple of comments. One of them is saying that it was called the Blue Goose because it was also the headquarters of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Oh, okay.
And we've got someone else saying that CIA veterans called it the Blue U because that's where their education and training department was housed.
Very good. Now, I knew the second one. I did not know the first one. I appreciate that. And of course, the Fish and Wildlife Service was in Arlington for many years, and then it got stolen by Falls Church. They moved it out there to Route 7, I think. Just like the National Science Foundation got stolen by Alexandria. You know, both were losses to Boston. Thank you for those facts.
And there's another comment here that the panels and the lighting are along the north side of the building. So anybody that goes to look for them.
Very good.
Yep.
Okay, I don't know how many of you recognize this, but it's called the Bay Ava Castle, and it's off near Spout Run in North Roslyn, near the Dawson Bailey Historic House, which is the second oldest standing house in Arlington. And this was built in the 1930s by a married couple. They were both, he was an OBGYN and she was in related fields and more of a business person. And they named it for, those are their first names, Bay and Ava Jacobs. And he modeled it on architectural style from his native Germany. And it was, it fell into disrepair after they died. They tried to give it to the College of OBGYNs, and something went wrong with that deal. And so it was rented out in the 80s, I think, to some young people, and then finally developer tore it down. So what's left there today, if you go on hikes there off of Spout Run, you can see the panel that explains all this and has pictures of it, and you can see the site where it used to be. Okay, so in the preservation book, I try to give some nostalgia for many of the old stores that are near and dear to Arlingtonians. And of course, Sears still exists on paper. You know, I personally still use it for appliance repair and duct cleaning, maybe. And they still have a logo on the building over in Seven Corners. So it's not totally dead. They did tear down the one at Landmark Shopping Center just in the last couple of months, actually. So, but everybody who studies history, of course, knows that Sears was a huge nationwide mail order catalog company starting in, who knows, 1890s, I think it is. And Sears homes, you could buy a kit home, and there are a couple of dozen Sears homes still in Arlington. They have tours of those. So I used to go to this Sears in Clarendon and buy musical instruments there. They had their own brand of Silvertone guitars and amplifiers. And of course, they had that garden center and everything. It was now today is the Whole Foods. You know. Okay.
So the main Sears building was across the street, just to the west of where Whole Foods is, right?
Yes. Yes. Very good. And I think the building was used by the county for social services for a while too, before it was turned out. Now it's a modern Clarendon Crossing, I think is the name of the development there too. So this is an actual house being transported in the early 1960s to make room for Interstate 66. So I've written whole articles on this. It's fun to remember that the plan to build I-66 goes back to the mid 1950s when the whole country was highway crazy. And the original vision there was opposition right away. I was in my garage when I first moved into this house in the early 90s. And I found lining the shelf in the garage was a 1964 little shopper newspaper. And it said, Thursday night meeting to block I-66. You know, this is 1964. So the original concept, it was supposed to be 12 lanes and chain link fences instead of what we see today are sound walls to link, you know, Gainesville through Prince William and Fairfax counties to DC. And of course, there was another talk, which I have in the book too, about having a bridge crossing the Three Sisters Bridge, which everything was highway crazy. So the federal government and VDOT together began confiscating land to clear the pathway, which is roughly Fairfax Drive. If you think of Fairfax Drive today, and then where it picks up again in Falls Church at the Econo Lodge, that was roughly the land that they had to clear. And so they offered, by our Constitution requires compensation if eminent domain is used. And of course, people argued about what the market value of their house was. And several dozen homeowners opted to hire technicians and trailers to move their homes to different lots. And this is one example of that. And of course, in 1970, they passed the National Environmental Policy Act, which required environmental impact statements. And there was a whole new movement of environmentalists to try and block I-66. And even though they'd already cleared the land for it. And that fight went on and on until 1977 in the Carter administration. That's when the Transportation Secretary Coleman released a final report with a compromise. And it was in 6 lanes with some sound walls. And it was built, open in 1981. Now, the railroads got started through Arlington in the 1890s. And I mean, the Virginia Railroad's much earlier, back to the 1850s, but Alexandria was more important to them. So it came through Arlington beginning in the 1890s and lasted all the way into the late 1930s. And then there was some freight train passage going out to Shenandoah that continued until the late 60s. And meanwhile, what today is Dominion Energy, but at the time was VEPCO, Virginia Electric Power Company, bought the trail path and used it for their towers and their wiring. And the rails to trails movement, this is in the mid 70s, got going nationwide. And the idea of converting the trails into bicycle and pedestrian paths, to which Arlington has greatly benefited from. I have to give them credit. All right, so then I finished the book with some old buildings that we can talk about in detail. The Northern Virginia Sun has had several offices. When it started in the 1930s, it was at the lodge that is today in the edge of Falls Church, but it had several offices in Clarendon, and Herman Obermeyer, who I got to work for a little bit toward the end of his life, would occupy it there at the entrance to Clarendon. And it's now a construction site right next to the Red Top Cab place where this was taken. All right, McQuinn Sporting Goods was in Clarendon, named for the professional baseball player. And he came back to, he was a W&L graduate in the 40s and 50s. He was in the St. Louis Browns ball club, and he came back to Arlington and started this, and they sponsored little league teams. Good memories of it. Tom Saris's restaurant, really, you know, that New Orleans wrought iron and their salad bar was famous. It really wouldn't fit today's modern glass tower Roslyn. So, but it was dear to the hearts of a lot of high school prom goers and daytime lunchers from the early 50s all the way through to the 90s. The public shoe store just closed about 4 or 5 years ago when Saul Freeman died. It originally was across the street. The site today is the Clarendon Metro, but and it started in the 1930s by his father. And it was also a meeting place for the Jewish community before they built their own temple out there on Route 50. And so I interviewed Saul a couple times, and he even gave me a brand new pair of shoes, which corrupted me as a columnist, but he insisted, so I accepted it anyway. Let's see. I just thought this was a fun shot of, looks like, judging by the cars, that it's late 1950s, but somebody might have a sharper eye than me. But this is Clarendon. You know, you can see a wealth of places that we all knew, but Penny's and the People's Drugstore, no apostrophe on People's, by the way. And there's a Murphy's further down to the left too, these 5 and dimes. There was no shortage of them. McCrory's and Ayers is the only one still there, really. And then finally, 2 slides, we talk about managing change in Arlington. In the preservation field, you can't stop change, but you can manage it. And people do get attached to traditions. And so there's 2 events that have taken place in Arlington that, and there's a third one, which I don't have illustrated, but we can talk about too, is the deconfederization of Arlington, which has been happening over the last 5 or 6 years, removing Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis's names. The merchants of Crystal City, who the hoteliers and restaurateurs and barkeepers were always thought it was odd that their address was Jefferson Davis Highway, which it's made a lot of visitors to Arlington, especially people from the north, think that they had suddenly gone to the deep south. And so they were pleased when we finally got authority from the state, from Richmond, and Alexandria had beaten us to the punch, to remove Jefferson Davis's name. This is 2018, I think, and put the more logical Richmond Highway, which is neutral and which also tells you where it's headed to. So this is the action happening there. And then similarly with the renaming of Washington Lee High School, in the book I have a whole recap of that whole affair, but it was triggered by the same violence in Charlottesville I mentioned earlier in 2017, and the Arlington School Board got the notion that it was really Lee's time had come for students shouldn't have to go to a school named for not only a slave owner, but somebody who betrayed the Union. That's the argument. Now, the alumni of Washington Lee are still upset about it. I hear from them when I write a column and I call it Washington Liberty instead of formerly Washington Lee. They want me to say that all the time. But they did write some very intelligent histories of why it's more complicated and why Robert E. Lee was a complex figure and a skilled general, etc., and had a great following. I do find it odd, though, I'll say personally, that the alumni that wanted to keep the name Washington Lee for the high school would argue that it was a great school with a lot of very successful graduates and people who accomplished a lot of things when they were students there. And I thought, well, nobody is denying that. You know, the people who want to demote Robert E. Lee are not saying that it's a bad school or nobody interesting ever went there. You know, so it was an odd sort of talking past each other kind of debate, in my view. But my friend Eric Dobson, who works for Preservation Arlington, snapped this picture of the name being implemented there. And so I thought I would end on that. And we have a few minutes if anybody has more questions or comments. I like comments too. So thank you.
A question. What was the previous name of Clarendon Boulevard?
Let's see. Wilson Boulevard was called Aubrey's Road before it was named for President Wilson, who used to drive on that road in the teens. Clarendon Boulevard is parallel to it, so I'm not really sure exactly how that all sorted out. Clarendon, of course, was a community going back to the early in the 20th century, and they wanted to secede in the 1920s. If you want to hear more about that, the Arlington Historical Society has a discussion of that tomorrow night at Marymount.
Okay, we got a comment here. Dave said he led a 10-mile hike from Roslyn to the Beltway along the proposed I-66 route before the decision to build the highway was finalized. And he also commented on how many trees were lost in the construction of the roadway.
That's a good factoid for me to know too.
And another one, Steve said he bought his Clark's Hush Puppies at the public shoe store.
Good for him, yeah.
Charlie, it's Anita. I wonder if you can, I'm a relative newcomer to Arlington, so it's been one way on Wilson and Clarendon as long as I've been here, but when did they set that up? I assume both of those streets were two-way at some point.
Well, let's think. See, I don't know if you know the whole history of the planning of the what's called the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, but the original plan for I-66 was to do the whole road the way it's done in part, which is with a metro track down the middle. And the Arlington planners lobbied, this is in the early 70s, the federal government and VDOT to say, we want to encourage development in Roslyn, Courthouse, and Ballston. So we would like you to reroute the tracks through the center of Arlington, and then we can have what they call it the wedding cake theory of development, that it gets, you know, it's more higher heights near the metro stations, but they gently slope towards lower heights towards into the residential areas. And this was a way of building a hot economy and a tax base in Arlington, but while preserving these residential neighborhoods, peace and quiet. So if you look at all those stores that are between Clarendon Boulevard and Wilson Boulevard and see how many of them are modern, that makes me guess that a lot of that decision to bifurcate was made in the mid 1970s, but we could look that up probably. So
a question here about how do you think the streets should be named? It sounds like it's a county procedure, right? But I think it depends on if it's a state street or a local street.
Yes. So the numbered streets like 29 is Langston Boulevard, formerly Lee Highway, and 301 is Old Dominion Drive, which used to be the railroad route out to Great Falls too. So the state does have some say on those. Columbia Pike, forget the name, the number of it, 285 or something, 287 maybe, because they're commuter routes too, and they have extensions in other jurisdictions. So that does get complicated. By the way, you'll notice I put this in my column recently that the renaming of Lee Highway to Langston Boulevard, the county has finished with its 71 intersections all remarked as Langston Boulevard, but the state VDOT is behind. So when you're driving on 66 and you see the green state signs, they still say Lee Highway. And I think there's about 20 of those. And I talked to the VDOT people, they say they're working on it. So yeah, I mean, when you're talking about naming, do you mean for cultural reasons, or are you talking about the process and how the street grid was set up?
Yeah, I asked the question and how I felt like is there's so many famous people that pass away every day. And it would be so nice to actually name new streets, those names, if there was some kind of a, order in the, county that you live in, because, there, it seems like we get these really strange names sometimes even, Pothole Street or something, and it's
I
like,
see.
what does it have to do with you honoring those who have gone before us? But also it comes to my mind that we could have like 30,000 Langston Hugh streets in the United States, and he's not from here. I just looked it up on Wikipedia. And so it'd be nice to have streets that are indigenous to your public servants and your supporters. And I have nothing against Langston Hughes Brown. I love him actually.
Well, by the way, Langston, it's John Mercer Langston is who Lee Highway was renamed for. So not Langston
I thought it was
Hughes.
Langston
Yeah.
Hughes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but Langston
Mhm.
Hughes, I believe, was named for John Mercer Langston. I have to double check that, but I think
Oh,
that's right.
I
how
think he
cool
was
is
his
that?
great nephew or something.
They they may be related. But I take your point that it's fun to personalize the streets. You got to remember the street grid was set up in 1932. It took effect in 35, and they'd have 3 syllables, 2 syllables, and 1 syllable grouped, and then they have alphabetically. And then when they get to alphabetically, there's just a lot of presidents in there. They threw in Buchanan. He was one of the lamest presidents. McKinley.
Yeah.
I mean, McKinley was not a lame president, but he was controversial. So people could say, well, I didn't like McKinley. I've heard people say that.
Mhm.
But the point is they have to be and this came up, by the way, in the February Lothrop House discussion, because I interviewed the Toll brothers. That home building, National Home Building Company, shelled out the 23 million and bought the February Lothrop property. And they're putting 40 to 44 luxury homes there. It's going to take them 3 or 4 years to do it. And we begged them, the Historical Society, to, can't you put a sign up? Can't you call it the Fabray Estates? Or can you have a community center? They didn't want any of that. So, but they toyed with the idea of naming the streets Fabray and Rouse. But it would be out of alphabetical order is the problem. So they would have to get a special pass from the county to do that. So
they could put Street of February or something like that, or Lane of.
Well, it would have to be an
L.
M. It would have to be an M. See, they're in the Madison Street
Okay.
is the nearest street, and McKinley is there, so it would have to be McGillicuddy or something.
Mansion February.
There you go. Hey, that's very clever.
Could we, as citizens, have a say in that? Could we call the developers, slip notes, do something?
Well, the developers get to pick it, but they do have to get the county board to okay it. They can't just pick anything. For example, I doubt they would be able to pick Stonewall Jackson or something, Can you imagine?
Okay.
Well, we are at our time today. We've got a couple more comments, Charlie, and so I'm going to thank everybody for coming. It is 11 o'clock. Some of us will need to do other things, but if you can hang on for a minute or two, we've still got a couple things. The comment here is about the Morey School and how it is on the corner of Wilson and Monroe. And Pat says her father went to Morey School before the grandmother moved back to DC. It's now the Art Center. I happen to live in that neighborhood. And so that house, that school has been preserved and turned into a new use. What I'm wondering though is the county still owns the property and leases it for, I think, a very low cost, like $1 a year to the nonprofit Art Center.
Yes.
Could the county do something with the grounds? There is some room. I know they're always looking for better park space. What do you think as a preservationist about keeping the grounds intact around the preserved buildings?
Yeah, when you say could the county do something, meaning not allow somebody to put a parking garage or build another house behind it or something, is what you're saying.
Well, I'd say on the county property, could the county put a pickleball court or something like that?
Boy, that would be, certainly they would have a lot of consultation with the Ashton Heights Civic Association before they get away with that, not to mention the Arts Center. By the way, before you sign off, I don't want to be too self-interested here, but if anybody wants to buy the Lost Arlington book, you can get it at Ayers or One More Page or Barnes and Noble if you want to come in person, but it's also on Amazon and Barnes and Noble online too. So
Very good, Charlie. And I also wanted to ask, I don't live in Falls Church, so how do I get to hear your weekly messages about our man in Arlington?
well, I send it out to about 200 people who, some are friends, some people have just asked me to put their name. So if you send me out an email, I can put your name on a distribution list.
I'm going to put your email in our chat box if that's
Yes, that'd be fine, Anita.
because I think that our man in Arlington has a lot of insight about those of us who live here.
Thank you.
I also wanted to put in a good word for naming the beaver pond behind the Blue Goose along the
Yes.
Custis Trail has gone under renovation, and the county is looking for new names. And I have submitted the Car Barn Pond,
Nice.
Car Bond Pike Park, Car
Nicely
Barn.
done.
So you want to talk about the Car Barn?
Yeah, so the Lacey Car Barn was sort of the roundhouse for the railroad and streetcars around the turn of the 20th century. And there's a nice sign there. There was a trolley stop there. And if you walk around the Blue Goose on Fairfax Drive, not far from where the construction is happening for that beaver pond, you'll see a historic sign marking how it was a real central hub in Arlington 120 years ago.
And the beavers are gone. So, all right. With that, we're going to say thank you again, Charlie.
All right.
We'll stop recording.
I enjoyed it, everybody.
Take care. We'll see you again, I hope.
Okay.